Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
The overall goal of this ongoing mini-series of episodes is to get a perspective on Jesus of Nazareth that isn't so inconsistent with the 21st century Western worldview. Because let's face it, a lot has changed since the first century. I'm not just referring to scientific advances and philosophical changes. We've learned a lot more since then about the book we call the Bible. There are countless portraits of Jesus available, like the portrait of a Jewish prophet-teacher in first century Palestine, or an enlightened individual who had a peculiarly strong connection to another dimension, and yet another portrait of a cosmic deity who existed before the creation of the universe. Or a milquetoast Jesus with soft and gentle eyes and unblemished skin, probably holding a lamb. Or the MAGA Jesus, complete with red baseball cap, bulging muscular physique, and military hardware, and many others.
Yeah, every culture seems to adapt Jesus to their cultural ideals. And so you have a black Jesus in many African countries and an Asian Jesus. And yeah, that is very interesting and very true.
So if we're going to get our own portrait of Jesus of Nazareth, one would think that the best sources for insight on the personhood of Jesus would be the gospel accounts. The 4 biographical books which were selected out of dozens of texts written at the time to be officially inducted into the New Testament canon by the early Christian church in the mid-4th century.
Yeah, the whole process of canonization is a huge study in itself, but I think a lot of people were quite shocked when the Dan Brown books came out, and even though they're terrible books as far as any history goes, but nonetheless, he did raise some things that I don't think people knew about. That there were other books, and they kind of made some choices between these different books and stuff like that. Yeah, that's true, and there was a real historical process there, and I think it's good that people have become more aware of those kind of things.
Right. So out of the many texts at that time, these 4 were selected. These 4 gospel accounts were selected by the church, roughly the year 400. And here's the thing. Most of the people sitting in the pews of a Christian church today, as well as some academic scholars, they would see each of these 4 books as having been written by and named after 4 individual people. A guy named Matthew, and also Mark and Luke and John. And many of those people would see those 4 authors as having been closely connected to Jesus. Matthew and John as disciples of Jesus, Mark being closely connected to the disciple Peter, and Luke being connected to the apostle Paul. And if those people were asked when those 4 authors wrote the accounts, that group of modern-day people I just referred to can be divided into 3 broad subgroups. One subgroup that acknowledges the accounts were written many years, maybe even decades after the events they describe. A second subgroup that insists on a much shorter time frame, and a third group that haven't thought about the question of the time frame at all. They just don't care. And here's where I'm going with those points. Most of the people in those 3 subgroups, almost all of those in the I haven't thought about that subgroup, and pretty much all of those in the it was just a few years subgroup, and a fairly substantial number of those in the it was decades before subgroup, all of those will read those texts as if they were written while the events occurred, as if those accounts were a transcript of a reporter on the TV news telling us what happened earlier that day. And the reason they treat them in this way, treat them as if they are totally factual, historical, accurate, inerrant, and infallible, is because they assume that God revealed the events to the writers of the Gospels and ensured that the writers told the story exactly as it was.
Part of the reason for that, I think, is because we are projecting our own understanding of how history is written and things are reported from a modern perspective. So when we read a biography or we watch the news, we expect to see some level of an objective account of the events. But the ancient world worked differently, and writers weren't as concerned about those kind of things as we are. They were more concerned about, in a sense, telling stories. And you see that not just in these Christian writings, but in ancient writings overall, Plutarch and so on, they're quite free with embellishment and adding things. And that wouldn't have been scandalous in their minds like it might be in ours. So we have to be careful of projecting our value system back on them.
Now, I just described three groups who are mostly the lay people. There's a few scholars who would hold to those ideas of the Gospels having been written very shortly afterwards, but otherwise, those are mostly non-scholars. On the other hand, scholars in the 20th century, they've been in broad agreement that it was a very long time frame, involving decades and possibly even a century in the case of John, and they will dispute over the degree to which faulty human memory reshaped or even distorted the telling of some of those events, and or whether those individual authors were helped by co-authors and editors, and the degree to which those authors borrowed material from each other and changed the details, adding, deleting, redacting. To those scholars, the Gospels are very much a human production through and through. And they might still talk about divine inspiration, but for them, this looked less like revelation and more like influencing or gently prompting, and it allowed for a lot of flexibility in the human input to the wording of those texts. And they certainly set aside the idea of divine dictation that some lay people might still insist on.
Yeah, it's interesting because historically, the Christian movement has never really embraced the dictation understanding of inspiration, yet in the popular imagination, that's how people, right? Whereas there are other faiths like Islam, for example, they do believe that the Quran was dictated and not one letter is out of place. But that has never been held by the Christian church overall. So it's kind of interesting that the phenomenon in evangelicalism in the U.S. and the insistence in that kind of a view is really more of a modern thing.
Yeah.
It's a reaction in a lot of ways to the Enlightenment, even though they don't realize it.
Well, and then things have moved on from there. We talked about the lay people, and then we talked about 20th century scholars. More recently, some scholars have reason to ask if it might have been an even longer timeline and a greater degree of cultural separation between the events that happened and the authors that wrote them. Some even saying that the Gospels were not written in the first century and mostly by blue-collar Jews, but instead these scholars will suggest the Gospels were written in the second century by elite, highly educated Roman Greeks. More on that idea in the second half of this episode.
Yeah, that's what our guest is going to address. It's fascinating.
Now, one last piece of background before we bring her in. As we said a few minutes ago, many Christians, lay people and scholars alike, are comfortable with the idea of gospel writers being influenced by other earlier gospel writers, borrowing ideas, sometimes even specific wording from the earlier writer. And to put a finer point on that, many will say that Matthew and Luke obviously used Mark's gospel account, which itself had been written 20 years beforehand. They would say that this kind of influence is exactly what you'd expect. There's no surprise here. But many of them haven't fully factored into that logic, that expectation, that there's yet another author who long preceded even Mark. The Apostle Paul wrote extensively about Jesus long before, many decades before, any of the four gospel accounts, perhaps even a century before in the case of John. Paul claimed to have also met Jesus, but he didn't meet the embodied human Jewish Messiah who was sent to the lost sheep of Israel and who would liberate them from Rome. The man that Matthew and John walked and talked with, and the walking buddy that the disciple Peter described to his student friend Mark. Instead, Paul met a disembodied cosmic deity who had a more global objective, whose mission extended far beyond Israel. And Paul didn't just stick around Jerusalem like Peter and James did, but traveled all over the Roman Empire preaching and writing with that very different portrait of a cosmic deity, Jesus. Early Christianity was saturated with that imagery and theology due to Paul's preaching and his letter writing during his travels all through the Roman Empire. That has to have influenced the thinking of the gospel writers and their portrait of Jesus 50 or 100 years later, after their memories had faded and then reshaped by Paul's portrait. It's kind of like people being interviewed about a friend they knew decades ago from high school who had since become world famous in a positive sense, becoming the president or a rock star, for example. Or a friend who had become infamous, maybe being convicted as a serial killer. And in the interview, they would say, yeah, I always knew he was going to do something like that. Even though the truth is that thought never occurred to them at the time. Instead, they dredge up memories of that friend, but now reframe those memories in the context of this new notoriety.
I think it's particularly interesting, the connection between Paul and the gospel writers. And that's an area that hasn't been probably explored to the extent that it should be or could be. I think it's really good that you bring that up because there's definitely a tendency to see Paul as a very separate, animal. You've got the Gospels and Acts, and then you've got Paul. And what you're seeing in Paul that you don't see in the Gospels, of course, is the development and formation of the early movement, this thing called Christianity. And so Paul's very focused on that. It is true, he doesn't talk much about the historical Christ. He didn't meet him in history, or we don't think he did. We don't know that, but we don't think he did. But that's not his concern. His concern is this new movement and what these events mean, particularly for Judaism. That's Paul's main concern, is what does this mean for this historical people called Israelites? How does this fit in with the history of Israel? And I don't think a lot of people realize that what we have in Paul is our earliest glimpse into the nascent movement of the Christian church. We tend to think that that's the Gospels, right? That if you want to understand the early Christian movement, well, you look at the Gospels. But really, Paul is even more so, because he's dealing with the church conflicts and the frustrations and some of the chaos in this movement taking off. And so that's like a lab, right? That's like a sociological lab that we can look at.
Paul did have an earlier view. He wrote down earlier than the gospel writers, but the point I'm coming to here is that Paul influenced the writing of those gospel writers decades later. And so to put a fine point on this, I want to really make sure that people get this. The same kind of historical revisionism that happens when one looks back on events in the past, this conviction that one has when they say that they always knew their high school friend was going to be the president of the country or a convicted serial killer, when in fact they didn't at the time, but it's easy to say that after the fact. I see the same kind of thing happening today when people read the gospel accounts and they'll point to this or that detail in the written text and insist that those followers in the first century had what theologians call a very high Christology, that those followers perceived Jesus clearly to be a divine being, the Son of God, deity incarnate. And I attribute that, in part, those little influences, those little details, to the Apostle Paul's influence on the writing of the gospel accounts decades after the fact, and also in part to a deep misunderstanding of when and by whom the gospel accounts were written. All four gospel writers are said to be eyewitnesses or talk to eyewitnesses about Jesus, and we're going to hear something different from our guest today. All four accounts clearly point to an embodied human Jewish Messiah. We talked about that a couple episodes ago, about how everyone referred to him as the Messiah. And I mean everyone, friends and foe alike, Jews and Romans, demons and angels, everyone in the gospel accounts called Jesus the Messiah. I know that I went through a stage where I would react to people saying that. I didn't realize that Christ was just another word for Messiah. So when people talked about Jesus being the Messiah, I said, no, he was the Christ. Do you think other people have that misperception?
Oh, I think, yeah, probably a lot of people do.
So Christ and Messiah are the same things. One is a Jewish word, one's a Hebrew word for exactly the same thing. It's the anointed one. And nobody back then would talk about God being anointed by anyone. And they just did not see the Christ or the Messiah as being a divine, a deity incarnate.
Right. I think what you see happening in the Gospels is the evolving understanding of what that meant. This whole idea of a Christ or of a Messiah, that was brewing in the first century, right? It was a time of great religious speculation, diversity. And so this guy comes on the scene proclaiming that he's that person. And their understanding of what that means is very different from how it ends up being, right? And so I agree with you on the issue of the high Christology, but to me, you see it as it's evolving and it's more,
right. Yeah.
It's more fully.
We're saying the same thing.
Yeah. It's more fully evolved, of course, when you get to Paul. But even in Paul, it's fascinating because some of his letters. Go ahead.
Well, I was agreeing with you. It is evolving, and I'm going to say it's evolving because Paul caused them to evolve their thinking. You're saying it did evolve once we get to Paul, but Paul was there to begin the evolution process.
It's possible, yeah, and maybe both.
Right.
I mean, we have to engage in speculation and just trying to piece things together in a common sense way. But yeah, I think it could work both ways.
So when we read the Gospels, we see that they talk to Jesus as if to another human. They engage with him as if with another human being. So when you see Peter rebuking Jesus for saying something that Peter didn't agree with, he's not talking to the divine, let alone to deity, because you don't rebuke God himself. Likewise, when we see Martha rebuking Jesus for not making her sister do more work around the house, her sister Mary rebuking Jesus for letting her brother Lazarus die, or Thomas saying, just let me touch the wounds on your physical body and then I'll know it's you, or Judas Iscariot saying, I'll walk right up to him and kiss him on the cheek and he's the guy you put the handcuffs on. These people are not interacting with a deity of cosmic dimensions who they see as God himself. They're engaging with another human that you can scold and manipulate and put in handcuffs. And I can say something similar about Jesus himself. His own words and actions betray the fact that, at least during the first part of his mission, he only saw himself as a human Jewish Messiah. A Jesus who saw himself as a cosmic savior would not have said he was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. And he would not have worried about drawing too much attention to himself from the Roman or Jewish leaders. So those little fine details in the written text that some people insist betray a very high Christology, I think those fine details could be artistic flourishes that were added to the portrait of Jesus. The authors of the gospel account record many of the words and actions of the people, which collectively portray a very human Jewish Messiah, Jesus, and then they, or later copyists, added those artistic flourishes to introduce a divine element into the picture. I want to give a couple analogies of what I'm getting at here to set the stage for our guest, who we're going to bring on in just a couple minutes here, but I just want to finish this foundation that we're building for her. And this is a couple analogies I want to give to help people get the idea that I'm presenting of the Gospels writing about a human, Jewish Messiah, Jesus, but then later on, these little embellishments that are added to make this human now a divine, a deity, and that people at that time all knew he was a deity. I think we retroject that conviction onto them. So the two analogies are this, and don't laugh too hard here. In the Back to the Future franchise of movies, Doc Brown and Marty McFly zip around in an absolutely amazing time machine. But when you look at that machine with a critical eye, it's just a 1981 DeLorean DMC-12 with some extra gadgets strapped onto it. The second analogy is, again, don't laugh too hard, in the Star Trek franchise of Hollywood films, the ones that involve encounters with the dreaded Borg, you have these absolutely frightening soldiers with weapons and electronic enhancements all over their bodies, but when you look at them with a critical eye, underneath all the gadgets and hardware, you just have humans that have been assimilated and customized by these technological enhancements. So in the same way, I now see artistic flourishes adding divine embellishments onto the gospel images of a human Jesus. I see this in Mark and more so in Matthew and Luke, and then John does this on steroids.
Yeah. The whole issue of John's gospel is certainly a very interesting one. And since we've been having these discussions, I've been thinking a lot about this, and we'll get into it more with Mark. We get into John more, but it's a very interesting discussion.
Today and in the next couple weeks, we're going to talk to two world-recognized scholars about who wrote the gospel accounts and when, about whether Paul in particular and Hellenic Greek philosophy in general influenced the writers of the gospel accounts, and whether this quality of divinity was retrojected onto the gospel accounts, and why John's gospel looks so very different from the other three gospels. This week, our world-class scholar is Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh. Dr. Walsh did her graduate training in religious studies at Brown University and an MDiv at Harvard University. She's now a scholar of early Christianity and the ancient Mediterranean, an associate professor of New Testament and early Christianity in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Miami, where she also serves as the university's Gabelli Senior Scholar. Dr. Walsh, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's a real joy to be here.
Now, one thing we like to do on this podcast before diving into the deep end of the discussion is to talk about our guest's background, their religious formation, or throw out a bit of a conversation starter, an icebreaker. And in your case, we've got both. I found out that your career in religious studies did not begin at Brown University. You grew up Catholic and did your elementary school training in a convent where you got daily religious education. And your interest in digging deep into the toughest Christological questions was piqued in 7th grade when Sister Yvette shattered your worldview by pointing out Jesus isn't white.
Yes.
And at some point during your more rebellious years of the convent, it was found out that you've been drawing mustaches on the pictures of Mary.
Yes, all of that is correct. And I still talk to Sister Yvette, actually. Yeah, she's part of the Sisters of the Holy Union. And so we are still in touch.
That's great.
Yeah, I think it was striking for me because I still remember so clearly. Sister Yvette was a seventh grade teacher, but it was one of these schools where, depending which grade you were in, you went to a different teacher for each subject, and she was the math teacher. And so sometimes she would just go into these meditations because she was also tasked with giving us religious education. And she clearly had a very critical eye, but it was not the right age group.
Yeah.
Like I started there, I think in sixth grade. So like sixth, seventh, eighth grade, maturing students, but certainly not the age where you would bring in a critical study of religion. And I just remember she would go into these kind of, I don't know what I want to say, like not fugue states, but she would go into these meditations on things like, why do we even do this? I don't want to speak for Sister Yvette. But I just remember her saying, like Jesus wasn't even white, like muttering under her breath. And I'd just kind of be like, mesmerized by this because
Yeah.
otherwise, yes, I did not quite understand theology. I had also done CCD. I was useless with any of the theological points of view. Didn't quite understand it. I liked the little pictures because I could draw mustaches on Mary, and I would, draw little cartoons around the images that I had in my workbook. I wish I could find those. I found one recently. So the upside was that I absorbed the critical study of religion monologues, but did not absorb the details of theology or traditional interpretations, and then went into classics. And so when I went back to the New Testament, I was sort of not fettered by the religious education I had received beforehand.
Okay, so Robyn, we reached out to you because we wanted a scholar to give us the latest perspectives on the gospel accounts, and you are certainly not going to disappoint. You're currently surfing a wave of notoriety within the scholarly community in your book you've just released, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, Contextualizing the New Testament Within Greco-Roman Literary Culture. And there are dozens of different directions we could take in unpacking that work, and I'm hoping we can hit on three in particular. We've talked earlier about what those will be. And we will dive headfirst into that, the most controversial development, the question of who actually wrote the Gospels and when. But I'd like to save that for the second half of our conversation. First, I just want to get your thoughts on whether the writings of Paul influenced the writings of the Gospels. And to start that off, can we establish one important foundational point? Irrespective of who wrote the Gospels and when and how, can we say that the Gospels tell the stories of living, breathing people? Is it reasonable to believe that the stories are based even loosely on real individuals named Jesus and Paul, Peter and James, Matthew and John, and all those others in an early first century setting in Roman-occupied Palestine?
It's great that you connected those questions because the answer to me is yes, that Paul's letters are an influence on the gospel writers. I tend to also subscribe to that point of view a little bit more sternly than some of my colleagues. Actually, I just saw Mark Goodacre. You mentioned Mark a moment ago, and he had a conference in Chicago, and he kept saying, you need to write this book about Paul influencing the gospel writers. He was kind of cornering me, saying, you have to do this. So maybe you could talk to him about this as well, because I want him to do it. But the way that I read, especially if you go through the traditional trajectory of Mark is our earliest gospel, and then, Matthew and Luke follow suit, and then John is presumably our latest. I see the way that the Spirit works in Mark and some of the ways that Jesus heals, some of the structure of Mark's gospel, especially, to be influenced by Paul. And an example that I often give for people to understand what I mean, even beyond, say, how the Spirit works in the gospel, something very concrete is Paul actually tells us in his letters that the risen Christ told him what happened at the Last Supper. And that account in Paul's letters is what appears in the Gospels. Now, some will say that's an oral tradition that comes from the Pauline trajectory as well as the gospel trajectory, except Paul is very explicit that the risen Christ told him this, that he received this information from the risen Christ. And so he tells us exactly where he got it from. And so those little details to me indicate that Paul's letters are in view. Now, maybe not all of the letters, maybe not even the entirety of one given letter, but certainly Paul's understanding of Jesus's significance, the significance of the death and resurrection. Again, things like how the Spirit works. Namely, the Spirit is kind of this active agent for Paul. It's the thing that links everybody together. If you're baptized into Christ, you become a co-heir with Christ, you participate with Christ, you're now part of this group, you're going to have a spiritual body after death. All of that you can see in the Gospels as well. I mean, beginning with Mark, from the way that the dove comes down with the Spirit and goes into Jesus and turns Jesus into God's Son. I mean, all of that language to me is very similar. And when you think about what might have been floating around in the first century for someone who wants to write a gospel post-war, because we do date the Gospels to after the Jewish War, what was floating around for somebody who's literate, who can read and write, that they can look at from the earlier stages of the Jesus movement? Well, Paul's letters, right? So even Luke tells us in his introduction, how did I write this thing? Well, I wasn't there, but I've talked to people who were, or who knew people who were, and I've gathered up all the writings I can find, and I'm going to give you my best account, an orderly account, he calls it. I'm going to give you my best version of what I think happened. And so he describes that process, and Paul's letters would have been part of that process. And, Luke is not shy, especially if we also think of him as the author of Acts of the Apostles. He's not shy about his love of Paul either. So I think we've underestimated how much Paul is an influence. And I think some of that has to do with the structure of the New Testament when you think about it too. I mean, like, we open it up and it starts with Matthew. And it tells us that story of Jesus and his followers and his death and resurrection and the mission. And then we get Paul's letters as this account of the development of the church, right? And so we're already sort of calibrated to flip-flop these two things in our minds. But if we flip them back into their chronological order, it makes more sense. As for how much the Gospels represent real people, the reason, again, I like you connecting these questions is because thanks to Paul, we do know some of these people are real. We know that Jesus was somebody who lived and walked around the earth, exactly what he taught, exactly what he did. Paul doesn't tell us about his healings or his teachings, really. He tells us a couple, but he doesn't tell us too much about Jesus performing miraculous deeds all over the Galilee or all over Judea. But he tells us that Jesus lived, that he died in the way that we see depicted in the Gospels, and that around him were people like Peter and James, because Paul meets them and talks to them and has arguments with them. In fact, they don't seem to get along, which is really interesting, right? So, we get little glimpses. Often people will ask me, do I think the historical Jesus is a real person? Did Jesus really live? Well, it wouldn't make we have more evidence for him than we do other people in the ancient world, insofar as we have these letters that are an account of a man who wasn't there, but had spoken to people who were, who authorized this idea that this was, these are historical persons. So we do get an idea of some details, but I don't tend to think that the Gospels are a reliable account of everything that Jesus said or did. Largely because if you look at the text itself, it seems to be borrowing off a lot of motifs or a lot of stories that already existed elsewhere in the ancient Mediterranean that were characteristic of telling a story about a notable figure or a hero or a great philosopher, right? It kind of borrows from those trends and other kinds of writing that already existed. And so when you look at that, it's hard to say that, well, this is the historical account, but all these others are made up, right?
Right.
You can't really make that judgment.
We are going to get into that in a few minutes, but I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here.
Mm-hmm.
I did connect those questions because here's the reason. Before we brought you on, I was talking with Scott, I was emphasizing how the gospel accounts uniformly describe Jesus as an embodied human Jewish Messiah. Everyone in those accounts calls him the Messiah, or the Christ, which is just Greek for Messiah, and everyone interacts with him as if he were a human. But on top of those vignettes of Jesus as a human, there's these little artistic flourishes of divinity, elements or words that are added which inject divinity into the picture. And so, for example, I mentioned Thomas saying, "Just let me touch the wounds on your physical body and then I'll know it's you," which undeniably speaks to Jesus' humanity. But then immediately Thomas says to Jesus, "You are my Lord and my God." And so I just see this constant underlying picture of Jesus as a human, but then these little flourishes of a divine aspect. And I gave two analogies of these artistic flourishes. One was a time machine that Doc Brown and Marty McFly get around in Back to the Future. It's just a 1981 DeLorean DMC-12 with some extra little gadgets strapped onto it. And then the other analogy was the absolutely frightening Borg soldiers in Star Trek, which a critical eye can see they're just humans that have been customized by technological enhancements. And so here's my question then. Is it a fair question to ask if the gospel writers were also remembering a very human Jewish Messiah, but now reframing those faulty memories decades later through a lens, a filter that they got from Paul, which accented the divinity of the disembodied cosmic deity that Paul met on the road to Damascus?
Well, I think it might be something that we have to look at to answer that might be a little bit different than the way you framed it, is that the gospel writers are clearly writing a story that is maybe not itself exactly a biography in the tradition that we might say, like Plutarch writes a biography of the emperors or something along those lines, or Alexander the Great. But it has those features. And we have to remember, we have all these different genres and genre expectations for what a certain kind of writing is supposed to look like. And we label ancient writings in certain ways. The ancients didn't necessarily have the same strictures, like they didn't necessarily put things in the same boxes. But I think what the Gospels are trying to do is tell a story that very much kind of mirrors a biography of this great man in many ways, but also kind of has these elements of influence from things like Homer, for example. Like Jesus in many ways resembles Odysseus. He is kind of people keep asking over and over again in the Odyssey, like, is this guy from heaven? Like, who is this stranger? We don't know who he is. Like, how do we understand? He must be some kind of spirit. He must be some kind of, like that kind of language was already out there. And so when the gospel writers go to write this story about that Messiah in the flesh, kind of in that period before he dies and then defeats death with his resurrection, confirming that he was the Messiah, which was Paul's point. How did we know that this guy was destined for greatness, in other words, or how did we know that he was greater than? And each gospel writer takes a different approach to this in some sense. Mark does that Pauline thing we just talked about, the pneuma. The Spirit comes down and transforms Jesus into God's Son, and then the Spirit drives him out into the desert, and the Spirit drives him to do this. And he's imbued with this power where he can heal people, or he can resurrect a little girl, or he can, talk to demons and exorcise them from people and put them into swine, and everything else that he can do in that story. It's actually, when you think about it, a lot of ancient physics. Both Paul and Mark are very concerned with, like, you understand the science behind this. Like, this isn't just ethereal spirit talk. So back to your DeLorean example, or, kind of making it very concrete, right? Like, there's maybe a science you don't totally understand, but they are giving you some kind of rational argument. And then the others, Matthew has his genealogy, and then uses the Hebrew scriptures as well as some Stoicism, but he uses, the Holy Scriptures to justify, like, well, this was predicted all along. And, here's how we can confirm that Jesus fulfills all of those expectations. And then Luke does that biography thing we were already talking about. And then John has that more ethereal kind of, like, he was the Logos and he was pre-existent, and that. But you can see each one has kind of there is a structure to how they want to tell that story. Mm-hmm. Do you see what I mean by, like, does that help start to answer the question?
So this is one question I'm going to ask Mark next week when we talk to him. But since you brought it up, I'll just see what you have to say. I was going to mention to Mark how, yes, Matthew and Luke, they both begin with these genealogies, which very much sets Jesus, he's rooted in the soil of first century Palestine.
Exactly.
He's a human. And then John comes along with, actually, Jesus was the Logos, this impersonal metaphysical principle that existed before the creation of the world. And I want to ask Mark, why would Luke and Matthew not even hint at this This is clearly John's idea, and nobody at that time seemed they didn't point at Jesus and go, "Look, there goes the logos."
Mhm.
Yeah, it's interesting. It just shows, I know if we want to call it the personalities of each gospel writer, but just I guess we would say what their points of interest are, or what they think is the most important thing to emphasize in telling this story. And I think, Mark has done a beautiful job of talking about it. For my money, there's nobody better in the field who can talk to you about how Mark is absorbed by, say, Matthew and Luke and changed, or he has this wonderful article he calls editorial fatigue, where he can tell, like one of the copyists got tired and made
Mhm.
mistakes. And he's really, really good at that. So I'd be interested to hear what he has to say, but certainly those philosophical concepts were all over the place in the first and second centuries. And if you were sort of a fancy, well-educated person, those are the kinds of topics you're going to trade in. If I can make a contemporary example that I've never done before, and maybe I'm going to regret this now that I started it, but I was talking to my husband about this the other night. Have you ever noticed like how much people talk in Freudian terms and it's just part of colloquialisms at this point? You just talk about your ego or you talk about somebody being a narcissist. I mean, that might not be Freudian, but we use these all kinds of psychological terms in our everyday talk, and it's a way of framing the world. It's a way that we view each other, we describe one another, and we view social exchange and how the world is structured. The gospel writers are doing the same exact thing, and that's why it's so important to understand their world. Because when they talk about the spirit, when they talk about the logos, when they talk about these things, everybody has kind of a different take on it. John has a more philosophical take than, say, Matthew. Although Matthew, again, he has the teachings. He has his own take on the teachings that are distinct from Luke, or even the genealogy that's distinct from Luke. They all, again, do have their kind of different perspective, but they do it in a way that speaks to their understanding of the world and what they want to convey to their audience.
Is there any analogy with what John is doing and what Luke tells us about Paul and the Areopagus, in the sense that, Paul is trying to say, okay, this unknown God, he's speaking to a Greek audience and a Hellenistic
Yeah.
audience. And so he really tries to accommodate and say, this makes sense. What's happened here makes sense, not just for Hebrews, but for pagans, that your culture as well has pointed in this direction. And I'm here to tell you,
Oh, yeah,
but you know what I mean? Is there a kind of
I
and John's
do.
kind of saying this logos, well, that's Jesus. It's not Plato. It's not Platonic. It's Jesus.
No,
Is
no,
that?
no. I completely agree with you. I'm actually somebody who tries to break down what sometimes scholars call the Judaism Hellenism divide as much as I possibly can, because even though Paul is a Pharisee, he remains Jewish. This is a Jewish movement in his mind, but he interprets the Hebrew scriptures to say, and I promise I'll get there. So Paul reads the Hebrew scriptures in such a way that everybody was God's people at one time. It's just the Gentiles are people who fell away. Think about the golden calf, right? They've made bad choices. They don't recognize who the real God is supposed to be. They're worshiping these idols and these false gods. Not to say that he even doesn't think that those other gods exist, actually. They're just inferior to his God, to the God of the Hebrew people. And so he understands that these so-called Gentiles, these non-Jews, have to get, as he says, grafted back into the family tree for the Messiah to come back. This is Paul's whole thing. And so he actually views these Gentiles in that way. And all of his language, again, back to this framing, goes back to Middle Platonism, he talks about the soul and the way Plato talks about the soul. He's clearly reading the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. He's not reading in Hebrew. He knows a few words. He knows a few words in Aramaic, but he is clearly, he's been educated in the so-called Greek way. So when he talks to the Gentiles, we tend to say like, oh, well, he's trying to calibrate things to a Gentile audience. Well, he is actually in the same boat. That's how he sees the world too. And that's how the gospel writers see the world too, because they are also writing in Greek and they're also
Right.
making the same references. And they've also read Paul and they've also read the Septuagint. And by the way, Gentiles are reading the Hebrew scriptures too. They're reading the Septuagint, and we know this because it's a very ancient text. Some people were using it for dream interpretation, actually. We have evidence of this. The Romans are always making laws saying, like stop charging money to do dream interpretation with the Hebrew scriptures. Like we have evidence for this kind of thing. We have curse tablets that will include Yahweh as well as other deities. So these worlds were mixed together. And the interesting thing is that I think, again, we tend to think of these things as very separate. But Gentiles would have been compelled by this message because Judaism was very ancient. After the Jewish War, there was even more attention on that region and on that particular religion. And it was that antiquity of that tradition would have attracted a lot of people, especially if they, were looking. Everyone always talks these days about like old money and new, right? Like this is kind of an old money tradition, right? Like these are very ancient families and an ancient tradition. And now you have a chance to maybe be a part of it. I think that was very interesting to people.
This is probably then the time that I want to now talk about your book. We're going to put this on the table again, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, Contextualizing the New Testament within Greco-Roman Literary Culture. We've been talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as individuals writing these Gospels some short number of decades after the events happened. But your book pushes against that. So in contrast to what scholars have been telling us for a couple centuries, 19th and 20th centuries, and what everyone that's sitting in the pews thinks these are individuals, 4 named individuals, 3 of whom are Jews. Luke might have been also Jew. There's some debate on that. And 2 of whom are said to be part of Jesus's inner circle, who collected and put together oral eyewitness accounts during the late 1st century. But you describe in your book this hypothesis, which is much of your PhD work, that the Gospels were actually written during the 2nd century by Greco-Roman elites and for a very different purpose. And so maybe if you could start us off with a quick 101 on this idea.
Sure.
And your book.
So, of course. So what I argue in the book is a few things, but to your description, so few people could read and write in the ancient world. The statistics kind of vary depending on what you mean by literacy, but someone who could write prose literature, which we were talking about before, we're talking about 10% of the population, maybe, or less. So we know quite a bit because of these surviving accounts, what writing looked like, what school looked like, what even acts of publication looked like. And I'm sure most people, intuit there was no printing press. So publication was a pretty expensive and time-consuming thing. But it was even, again, by order of magnitude, more difficult in antiquity to do these things. To be able to be educated to the degree that you could write something from scratch, the way that the gospel writers have written their accounts, would have taken a fair amount, there's no other way to put it, of leisure time. It meant that you could be educated, again, whether it was because you had the financial means to be educated and take the time away from, say, working the fields to, get your crops, or bake bread in a bakery, or, so on and so forth, right? You didn't have to, work for a living in the traditional sense. You weren't a subsistence farmer, for example, or you were enslaved by somebody with the means to educate you for their household to do things like write out copies of publications to send around to your friends, or, be trained in other ways for, you have a dinner party and you need somebody who can read out loud to your dinner guests as entertainment. And I really recommend the work of Canada Moss on enslaved labor in the ancient world. But these are the kinds of people who were able to read and write in a very sort of circumscribed social world in which it was even possible. And so what I have argued is that this idea that the people around Jesus, who by all accounts were, Galilean peasants or fishermen, people who were kind of at that subsistence level, were not literate. There may be, moments, I don't know, in the Gospel of John where Jesus writes something, but most likely he wasn't himself literate either. Paul is the first one, as we've talked about, who blips on the screen, who was well educated as a Pharisee, who was able to write anything down. And he is not very concerned in those early years with what Jesus said or did, mostly because Jesus is supposed to come back, as Messiah, and the world as we know it is supposed to end. So nobody is particularly interested in documenting anything. By the time we get to the gospel writers, we think writing in the late first or second century, the only one who gives us any indication of their process is Luke, which we've already talked about. And he admits he's not an eyewitness. And he gives us a description of his process, which every historian in antiquity gives, which is I talked to people who said they saw something, and then I made my own judgment of whether or not I thought it was good. None of the gospel writers tell us who they are. None of us say, like my authority in this account comes from the fact that I was there and I was a companion and I know all of that comes later. The idea that, Mark is Peter's scribe, I think is something that we hear, or he was his secretary or something like that. All of those kinds of associations are much, much later from the church fathers trying to authorize these earlier accounts in certain ways. So when you combine the fact that I call the gospel writers cultural elites, what I mean by this is that they weren't necessarily all rich guys who could write, but they were people who had been educated, had read Homer, had read Plato, knew what the intellectual and literary currents of the age were, and then tried their hand at their own Jesus story, engaging all of those tropes, all of that language. We just talked about the logos or the spirit, the word in Greek is pneuma. They engaged all of these ideas that are the currents of the period. They engaged all the literary tropes that they were taught in school. We can see it in the Gospels themselves. They were reading the Septuagint and brought that in, and they combined all of this into a story that looks very much like other kinds of Greek literature, Greek and Roman literature of the period. And so when you realize that, you realize how discrete a process, a social process it was for someone to produce this kind of literature. It breaks down that story that we have traditionally told, again, that has come from, later church fathers or for church tradition, that these were direct followers of Jesus, or that this was an oral tradition of a community that was written down to be able to preserve Jesus's teachings and doings at the close of the first century, so on and so forth. It really breaks that all down, because a literary analysis and comparison and understanding of how literature was produced tells us the Gospels are there's no other word to use, ordinary. They are very, very ordinary kinds of literature when compared with other literature from the first and second centuries.
I read a lot, and I've read hundreds, if not maybe thousands of books over my little lifespan. And but once in a while, you read something that is paradigm shattering, that is really, really new. And I was absorbed by your book, seriously. But it completely goes against all of my previous training. And because what you just described is exactly the way, if you go to a theological school, typically that's the story you're going to get, that you have oral tradition, you have these communities, these Christian communities, and these authors were writing for those communities. And what we need to do is read the Gospels in light of not just what they're saying about Jesus, but what they're saying about those communities. And I have taught this, and I preached at one point, and I preached, and to read your book was frustrating because I'm thinking, wow, you just turn it right around. But that's great. Now, I'm not in the field, obviously, I'm not a scholar. And so I'm sure in your world, maybe these ideas aren't maybe as radical, but it seems to me that your proposal is pretty bold.
Yeah.
Especially in light of, if you look at the whole German, like you talk about romanticism and the woke, and the connection there and so on. It's really fascinating. So what's that been like? Have you had a lot of pushback?
Well, let me say a couple things about that. So one is that it's not that I don't think Christian communities existed, right? And so that's one thing to be careful. So that you told that story about the Christian communities and that's not so bad, right? Because I also say in the book, these are elite culture producers, meaning they were educated, they are part of a rarefied group of people who could do this. But also, why would they write about this if they weren't part of, if there wasn't a Christian group somewhere, right? They're probably part of an ecclesia somewhere, because why else do they care, right? Now, where I draw the line as a scholar is I say, but I can't tell you for sure what is oral tradition and what the community said and so on and so forth, right? Like
Right.
that's where I don't get so sure, because what I can tell you though is I've read enough ancient literature to say, well, this is a trope that I've seen in Homer. And
Yeah.
like the empty tomb, right? Like Paul tells us Jesus was buried. The Gospels tell us Jesus was entombed. There are whole books, and Richard Miller comes to mind, right, about how many missing bodies and empty tombs are all over ancient literature. It's everywhere. I think I counted like 36 of them in the book, right? So that's a literary trope. So like, can I tell you the historical Jesus was entombed? I don't know. Like that seems to be something that was part of storytelling. And I'm not sure the ancients cared so much about what actually happened that they could verify versus giving you an impression of what happened, if you see what I mean, right? So that's where I draw the line. I don't know what's community. I don't know what's oral tradition. I can kind of tell what's literary. And so that leaves us with kind of a mess, which is interesting and something for us to move forward with. And one thing about the Romanticism piece, so people have a backstory, and that is, of course, when I started to think, well, our traditional explanations don't really make sense when I look at other ancient literature, I had to ask the question, well, why is that? And I went back to, the field itself, the critical study of religion is pretty young. It's only about 200 years old,
Yeah.
and comes from this university model that really came from Germany. And a lot of the critical study of religion also came out of German institutions. And I myself was trained by German scholars, and so I could see my own trajectory there. And so I wanted to go back and figure out, where did we get this method from? Because it's so different from classics. And one thing that I identify in the book is that at the same time, people are starting to evaluate the Gospels in a critical way in the university. It's around the same time you have the Brothers Grimm looking for the oral traditions of the German folk, right? And you have a lot of you have the American Revolution, you have the French Revolution, you have Germany becomes unified, and you have a lot of this kind of nationalistic, like searching for the history of different people for nationalistic purposes and coming up with origin stories. And Christianity gets treated like a national identity in a certain way.
Yeah.
And you start to see scholars looking for the oral traditions of the Christian people the same way the Germans are looking for the oral traditions of the German people. And Shakespeare starts to represent the English and, so on and so forth, right? Voltaire represents right? Like everybody's looking for like that genius who represents the national identity of a group. And Christianity gets treated the same way. And so I identify that tendency to look for oral tradition as a way to speak about origins and identity as what happens to New Testament. But I don't think that that's a historical explanation, because we understand how mystified that is in other cases. And so I brought that to bear on the Gospels. So when I published it, I believed in my position, but I wasn't sure what the reception would be. And I thought maybe, like most academics, maybe no one would read it. But I have been pleasantly surprised that people were receptive to the argument, because I wrote it very much the way I wanted to. I try to write it in a way that was accessible. I spent a lot of time reading New Yorker magazines and New York Times review of books, like trying to figure out, how do I write in a more editorial way than an academic way? Because I wanted it to be something that was easy to read and understand, and not so dense with, there's some stuff about Bourdieu and the usual kind of posturing in it. But it seemed that people could sympathize with the argument. And so I've been very pleasantly surprised by that. And I think some of what I just talked about in terms of contextualizing the study of religion in terms of things people know about, like we've all heard about the Grimm brothers, we've all seen Disney movies, like, right? So I think that helped. And so I've been very pleasantly surprised that people have been receptive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
So I just want to jump in very quickly with this one question that occurred to me. You were talking about these Greco-Roman elites in the 2nd century and how they were familiar with all this Greek classic literature. and they were writing these Gospels with that in view. And I was remembering something written years before Jesus was born, and it's basically talking about Caesar Augustus, and Christians have found it useful to repurpose this announcement. It was for Caesar Augustus, and they've repurposed it for Jesus Christ. So this is what it says. The goddess Providence, which has ordered all things and is deeply interested in our life, has set in most perfect order by giving us Augustus, whom she filled with virtue, that he might benefit humankind, sending him as a savior, both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things. And since he, Caesar Augustus, by his appearance surpassing all previous benefactors, and not even leaving to posterity any hope of surpassing what he has done, and since the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good tidings, the euangelion, where we get the word evangelical, he was the beginning of the good tidings for the world that came by reason of him. And so again, I mentioned how Christians have found this very useful to repurpose for them. That's where my question begins. So you say these are second century Greco-Roman elites. And in the second century, Rome was at its peak. And I would imagine these elites were all they were pro-Rome, they were MAGA Rome. And why would they now write this story of a guy named Jesus Christ, a Jew, and take this idea that was Caesar Augustus and now repurpose it for this first century Jew? Why would they do that?
Well, so let me just give a little bit of context. So there are multiple inscriptions about Octavian, who becomes Augustus, the first Roman emperor, who was emperor, by the way, when Jesus is born, including this one. The word that means good tidings or good news, that's actually the word gospel in Greek. So that's the word that's where we get gospel. But all these terms, ecclesia, church, pneuma, spirit, good news, or evangelion, gospel, soter, savior, messiah, all these words already existed way before. And we're all being deployed way before Jesus is on the scene, to your point. The Christians don't invent any of this stuff. They are using the language that's already out there that everybody else knows. I mean, even that word evangelion that we use for gospel, I just spoke about, I had to take a Medea seminar. It's all over the Medea. Whenever anybody brings news, into town, it's the good news. Like, here's the good news about the war that took place. We won, or something along those lines, right? So it's not, I would say, so much that, and Jesus is going to be a king, right? He's going to rule in this new kingdom that's to come as Messiah. This is what's been promised. And so the early Christians are just using the language that's already out there. Even ecclesia, it's the word for assembly. It was essentially like an ancient, like a union that usually had some deity that was the, sponsor along with some patron. Who's Paul writing to? Potential patrons. Who's the deity who's being represented by this particular assembly that they're, collecting money for the saints, which is what other ecclesia were doing, collecting money for the common good. It just happens to be Christ, right? Even the word Christ, Christos, anointed one, same thing. Like, all of this language, even the concept of adoption. Octavian was adopted by Julius Caesar, and anointed Christos as, his successor. All of this language already existed. And so I don't see that as so much of a challenge as just trying to recalibrate our understanding of the context, where early Christianity does not exist in a vacuum. It does not come out of nowhere. And the thing that might seem novel to us is the association with Judaism, except that, this was an even more ancient tradition, religion, people, set of texts, ideas, and practices than even the Romans. And even the Romans knew that. The Romans were already stealing everything from the Greeks and the Egyptians, just add the Jews to it, right? They were always sampling from these more ancient civilizations than their own. And that's what colonialists do. They were colonists. We have to understand that it was an empire for a reason. And so they were borrowing all of this. It was this exchange, cultural exchange. You had the occupying force that the Christians were agitating and the Jewish people were agitating against, being the Romans. But then they are still within that cultural system. They are still within that ancient Mediterranean world that is controlled, even increasingly, as to your point, by the second century. Rome, again, at its height, they determined the context that these people are living in, if you see what I mean. They have the cultural, linguistic, religious, political control. And so these people are functioning under that umbrella.
You talk about in your book about subversive biography, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So is there a sense of subversiveness here where
Sure.
they're taking this story about Augustus, they're saying, guess what? It's not Augustus who is that Jesus represents for the Christian that. So there's an undermining of the authority of Rome here. Maybe subtle, maybe not so subtle. I don't know. I mean, maybe this is why Christians were persecuted to some extent. But so what do you think of that?
Oh, I think it's absolutely a possibility. I don't think it's uniform across the board, right? We don't know where some of these texts come from. They're not all written by the same person. There are multiple people involved here.
Right.
But the reason I talk about subversive biography is that, it's almost kind of tongue in cheek, or I see it as almost like you're saying, kind of a wink and a nod, right? Like, yeah, we're going to tell the story about this guy who's the real king. And here's the paradox. He's the Messiah and he's going to die. And you think that means that he's weak, or that means that
Right.
Rome has won. But guess what? He had to die in order to marshal his heavenly army, and he's going to come back and he's going to defeat you. Right? Like
Hmm.
that's what's going on here, right? And
Yeah.
as a narrative, I think we have to remember, we talk about the Roman Empire. Even people today talk about what their Roman Empire is. And we talk about, I think, the Roman Empire in a very sort of positive way. This is why I like Monty Python, because I think Life of Brian captures this really beautifully. But these people didn't want to be ruled by Rome. They just had no choice, right?
Yeah.
Like often when people are ruled by authorities that they don't want to be under. And
Yeah.
so, the Germania didn't want to be under Rome. The Gauls didn't want to be under Rome. The
Right.
Brits didn't want to be under Rome. And the Judeans didn't want to be under Rome. And the Egyptians certainly didn't either. But they were all subject to this. And so some people get with the times and say, if we want to have economic, stake in what's going on in this empire, we have to adapt and we have to assimilate, and we're going to do things the Roman way. And some people said, hell no, right? And that's, some people
Yeah.
buy into authority and some people don't. And so that's a really interesting way to approach these texts.
So I'm curious if you have an idea in terms of what most people expect from Messiah. Why
Yeah.
did this failed Messiah who died an ignoble death, and there are other examples of Messiahs, right, that were
Yeah.
killed and
Josephus
so
tells
on.
us about him. Yeah.
Yeah. And nobody else except scholars know about them, right? But this one changed the world. What happened there? Like, what do you think? What's behind, I don't know if that's a big question, of course, but I just wonder if you have
I
thoughts.
mean, it's actually, to me, kind of simple.
Okay.
I think it's Paul.
Okay.
Not necessarily because I think Paul was super successful in his lifetime necessarily, because we don't actually know what happens to him.
No.
But his description of the Messiah is supposed to defeat the evil, the word is often used archons, like the evil
Mm,
rulers. That's what the Messiah is supposed to do. Paul has a unique authority in interpreting the Hebrew scriptures because he is a Pharisee and he has a very innovative take on this, which I hinted at, which is he says that Jesus basically allows himself. I'm playing a little fast and loose here, but he's crucified because he has to die in order to defeat death. Because, one of the things that you see over and over again in Paul's letters, but, this makes good sense intuitively, is that, you're sorry to put it this way, but you're in a time period, like there's no penicillin. There's no,
yeah.
there's no NyQuil. Um,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, like you guys know, my son just came home from school. There's no
Yeah.
Tylenol.
Yeah.
Right? Like I could feel my throat's going. I'm gonna need something
Yeah.
after this. I caught whatever he has over the weekend. And so people like the life expectancy was 22 years old. And so like in a world in which, Paul is saying that there's going to be a kingdom to come where you're going to have this pneumatic body, you're not going to get sick, you're not going to die. You're not going to be hungry. He talks about you're not going to be subject to the passions of the body. So eating, drinking, sex, so on and so forth. But like, imagine you don't know where your next meal's going to come from. You're not going to have to worry about that anymore. But one of the greatest evils on this earth is death, which everyone is subject to. So, you're
Yeah.
watching your
Yeah.
children die. You're watching, a lot of,
Yeah. Yeah.
family members don't live very long at all, or you watch them suffer and die and you can't do anything for them. And so to have a promise of, he died because he defeated death, and I know he did because I saw him. He has resurrected. And I know that means, like yes, the Messiah was supposed to be kind of this military figure, but our regular military is not going to defeat the Romans. We know this, right? The whole Mediterranean world is well aware that
Yeah.
you are not going to defeat the Romans. So you're going to need some means that are beyond traditional warfare. This is what's also interesting about Josephus, who was also a Pharisee in the Galilee, by the way, who goes out to meet the incoming Roman army by his own account. The Pharisees were marshaling together their own armies to meet the Romans when they come in during the Jewish war. And they saw the boats coming and everyone ran away because they just knew it was futile, right?
Futile.
So the traditional army is not going to cut it against these guys.
Yeah.
So Jesus dies, defeats death, and he's going to now get together all of the angels, daimons, saviors that people already talked about being out, up kind of, we imagine, up in heaven, right? He's going to marshal them together and he's going to come back. That's the Messiah who's going to come back. And that's going to be the kingdom you're a part of, where you're going to have the same spiritual body that he has, and you're not going to suffer any of these things anymore.
So in a word, hope.
Yeah. And
hope in a pretty dark world.
Yeah, because the other messiahs you reference, Theudas, is it Theudas who goes down to the Jordan? He says he's going to part it like Moses to demonstrate his power, and the Romans cut his head off right there and there. Over.
Yeah.
Over,
yeah.
Whoops.
Yeah.
Bar Kokhba, who's in the 2nd century, he gets even further. He actually kind of takes things back over. He's even minting coins. He's kind of like certain things, like these guys just keep getting their butts handed to them over and over again. All these other, people who say that they're going to be this martial messianic figure. The one who survives all of these different incursions of messianic hope is the one that makes the biggest promise. Yeah.
All right, so I've got one more question before we should wrap things up. We've been talking about the authorship of the Gospels being extended into the 2nd century Greco-Roman elites. We've talked about that. And so in my mind, as Scott said earlier, I've got to do a whole reframing of things. And now in my head, I've got a 1st century Mark and a 2nd century Mark. 1st and 2nd century Luke, Matthew, and John as well. I've also heard you refer to a 1st century Paul and a 2nd century Paul.
Yes.
And so what did you mean by 1st century Paul and 2nd century Paul?
Well, you have the 1st century guy writing letters. He's a Middle Platonist. He's one of our only surviving Middle Platonists. He's kind of in that mold of a Philo, where he's read the Septuagint. He's been educated in Greek, and he's interpreting the Hebrew scriptures in a way that is relevant to his own life, that happens also to be relevant to his outreach to the Gentiles, right? So he straddles, both of these lines. He's participating in this outreach to Gentiles because that's his reading of how he is going to bring Jesus back, right? Like, how is he going to have this messianic movement start? There must be a certain number of Gentiles that have to come back into the fold, those ones that fell away. And he's doing this outreach, trying to figure it out. He's starting these assemblies in the model that already existed in these cities. And that's how he's kind of infiltrating into these different areas. What those letters exactly looked like, there's some evidence. For example, the Corinthian correspondence, there might have been like 3 letters. Either we're missing one, or maybe a few of those letters have been spliced together and we call it 1st and 2nd Corinthians, right? Did everybody kind of circulate all the letters at once? Well, by the time you get to the 2nd century, the letters are kind of circulating as a piece. But then you also have some evidence, like there's one flax merchant where they found a couple pages of Romans, right? He didn't have the whole thing. He had a couple of pages stuck as a bookmark in something else, right? um, so, like second century Paul becomes a hero of the movement. He wrote it down. He was there in the first century. He had this really innovative interpretation that we've talked about, and he's probably, those writings circulated, motivated a particular view of Jesus when the gospel writers start to write it down. But he wasn't there. He didn't know Jesus. Frankly, he doesn't get along with James or Peter very well. He's talking to Gentiles, which you get the distinct impression from his own account that James and Peter are like, whatever. Yeah, sure. Gentiles, go ahead. Leave us alone. Thanks for the money. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for the interest. Thanks for the funds. Yeah, Paul, that sounds good. Go do what you want, right? And so when you get to the second century and you start to have the gospel circulating, you have the church fathers starting. The church is now definitely a thing. Christianity starts to be called its own, movement. The Christ movement is more secure. People still want to use Paul. Paul starts to circulate as part of this proto-canon of what's going to become the New Testament. But we don't even know what happens to him. Right. So he's reimagined in the second century, I think, as this founding figure of the movement. We then imagine the assemblies, the churches being more cohesive than they probably really were, more coherent than they probably really were, that Paul was more an authority figure than he probably really was. Acts of the Apostles comes in and makes it so that he's really kind of like part of the gang. It's like a good buddy movie. It's like The Hangover, they have all these little adventures together and they all get along. In iconography, you start to see all of these icons of Peter and Paul snuggling. They're so cute. I have one whole book in my office of them, these little medallions where they're together. In the catacombs, you see this, the Roman catacombs. Usually you have Peter on one side, Paul on the other. And so you start to, second century Paul's a hero of the movement. He's a founding figure. When I say that, this morning I was watching Ken Burns' Revolutionary War documentary when I was eating breakfast. And, that's all fiction. We know George Washington didn't chop down the cherry tree. We know that the revolution was far more fragmented than our mythology about the founding of America. But back to my point about, an idea of Christian nationalism emerging from the same period where German nationalism, American nationalism, French nationalism, so on and so forth starts to develop. These stories give us a secure foundation. They make us feel better about the systems, the traditions that we structure our own lives and viewpoints after. It makes it feel authorized. And so second century Paul's an authorizing figure, that the movement was coherent and transparent and people converted to it without question because it was obvious from the beginning that everybody was on the same page, that it was, I call it the early Christian Big Bang, that Jesus came, he died, and boom, everybody knew exactly what to do. And everybody, Paul knocked on the door and said, good news. All you have to do is be baptized and eat the body and blood of this Galilean peasant who was crucified, and you will get a spiritual body and live forever when the, angels come back. And when you think about the story, you're like, yeah, that took some time.
Yeah.
That one took some time. And I don't think, especially when you read some of these letters, that everybody they either misunderstood the message or they're kind of falling in and out of these assemblies, or, it wasn't that neat because people are messy. And so I think if we embrace the messiness, you start to understand that second century Paul is there to try to keep everything organized and give an origin story to early Christianity that doesn't correspond with reality.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
We have gone very long, but maybe before we draw a line under this, was there anything that you had hoped that we would talk about, that you would talk about in this conversation with you?
Oh, thanks for asking that. No, this was great. You guys really gave me a lot of space to to talk and ramble on, which I appreciate.
What are you working on now? Are you working on any new things?
Yeah, I've had a lot of different articles come out over the last year or so. Right now I'm working on, I would say, 3 or 4 big projects. One is a book on picking up on that German Romanticism piece, where each chapter takes a taken for granted methodology within New Testament, and I explain how it really kind of goes back to German Romanticism. And then I give an alternative that's much more grounded, I think, in the study of ancient literature to understand the early Jesus movement. I'm editing the Cambridge Companion to the non-canonical Gospels because I thought it would be interesting to branch out into that area. I'm also developing a book right now that might be a more public-facing volume on Paul, because when I went to grad school, actually, I went for Paul. I didn't go for the Gospels. So sometimes people can tell like my true love is really Paul, but that's why I studied so much philosophy as well, because I was really trying to understand Paul's language and approach. And so it's fun for me to go back to Paul and kind of rekindle that first love that I had for his work. But I have a lot of different articles, and I had an article about what Paul thinks the moon is. I'm working on an article right now on when Paul talks about having those visions of the risen Christ or receiving information from the risen Christ. What are the mechanics behind that? What did that look like? So I always have a lot of different projects.
That's great. That's great.
Okay. Thanks, Robyn.
Thank you for having me, and anytime. It would be my pleasure.
Fantastic.
We will do that. Yep. Bye now.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com or leave them at our YouTube channel. Same name, same logo. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.